Architect Robert Venturi and architect and urban planner Denise Scott Brown met while both teaching at the University of Pennsylvania in 1960. The pair bonded over their shared interest of ornamentation and historical influence, and have been identified as the founding members of postmodernism. In the early 1960s, Venturi challenged the rigid rules of modernism and designed the Varna Venturi House, exploring symbolism and contradiction, and consequently designing one of the first examples of postmodern architecture. In the late 1960s, Venturi and Scott Brown, along with 13 students, went to Las Vegas to study the Las Vegas Strip. The book, Learning from Las Vegas, was published in 1972, and their findings explore commercialism, signage, symbolism, and historical influence in the context of the highly commercialised setting of the Las Vegas Strip. The book continues to be a significant piece of literature and is still widely used in many architecture schools today. In this presentation, we will analyse the main findings of the book, including the key identifiers of postmodernism. We will also further explore the roles of signage and commercialism, as well as how Venturi and Scott Brown identified building typologies associated with postmodernism. Lastly, we will each analyse our own cities of Melbourne, Sydney, and Istanbul in reference to the theories discussed in the book Learning from Las Vegas. Postmodernism first arose as an architectural style in the early 1960s and began to flourish during the 1980s through the 1990s. The style was predominantly founded and introduced by the husband and wife team Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, and presented to the public through their book Learning from Las Vegas, released in 1972 with co-author Steven Eisenhower. Postmodernism was a direct response and retaliation to the strict rules and limited freedom of the modernist movement. It fought for the reintroduction of ornamentation, symbolism, and historical precedents, and explored relaxed rules of style and architectural influence. Postmodernist designers were encouraged to use a wide and varied toolset while designing, including drawing inspiration from a range of historical contexts and using as many methods and materials available to them, a stark contradictory to the austere modernist style. Modernist architect Mies van der Rohe was famous for saying, "Less is more," to which postmodernist Robert Venturi's response was, "Less is a bore." Although varying widely in their appearance, the characteristics of postmodernist buildings were relatively unified, most notably the way that form was used playfully. Buildings were often rich in symbolism and historical context, and this can be seen in Robert Venturi's design of his mother's house, which references a symbolic picture of a house from the 18th century, with its use of symmetry and the archway over the entrance. Here we will further explore symbolism and historical influence.
Modernism was a new style of architecture with a rigid set of rules. However, postmodernism was a style of architecture that wasn't afraid to embrace the old style of ornamentation and asymmetry. It was about not being tied down by a strict set of rules, and allow experimentation in architecture to occur. It instead encouraged architects to look at the past to influence their future designs. Postmodernism wanted to work with the forces of commercialism and popular culture, instead of searching for ideal forms stripped of decoration or the influences of history. Postmodern architecture embraced history and was full of references to it. In an interview, Venturi said, "I had employed historical reference as a way of analysing and learning. I did not propose imitating historical buildings." As teachers, both Venturi and Brown encouraged their students to copy from the masters, with Venturi saying, "It is better to be good than original." We learn from the past. Not everyone wakes up with completely original ideas that weren't influenced by something or someone before it. During the 1960s, they found the reference to history exciting and new. However, it was just a form of evolution, as Venturi puts it. Modernist slogan was, "We're starting again." We are not starting again. We were evolving.
At the turn of the 20th century, modernist architecture favoured a removal of symbolism from design. Adorno tells us that this removal of symbolism in architecture was a symptom of a culture that had lost its attachment to symbolic and functional meanings. This purist and strictly functional type of architecture is explained by Venturi and Brown as a reaction against eclecticism and the picturesque. In analysing modern cities today, the removal of symbolism is evident in the dominant glass skyscrapers and the Corbusian vertical apartment blocks. Venturi and Brown saw the removal of symbolism as a failure of architecture to connect to the past and a failure to evoke explicit associations. Pinder also described this failure as a crisis in the modernist vision, resulting in a postmodernism of resistance. The city of Las Vegas is where this resistance is obvious. In their book Learning from Las Vegas, Venturi and Brown allow us to see an alternative modern city which reintroduces classical symbolism and historical meanings to architecture. Venturi and Brown tell us that in Las Vegas, architecture is not enough. Instead, symbols dominate the landscape as they facilitate communication and the formation of relationships. In resisting modernism, Las Vegas allows symbolism to experience a renaissance. In Las Vegas, the buildings proudly incorporate an eclectic and exotic range of symbols and are permitted to do so in an explosion of unconstrained combinations.
Their book, Learning from Las Vegas, was a description of what I believed was the direction they saw design heading in with the growth of automobiles, and with the influence of commercial design that has become incorporated in many new countries influenced by Western ideals of capitalism, allowing consumerism to influence their design of architecture. Australia is one of these countries as it is quite new and always seems to be following behind in America's footsteps. Postmodernism accepted consumer culture and wanted an architecture based on a multitude of references. This is where capitalism found the fire to grow within architecture. However, in some cases it left something to be desired. Their buildings were mostly about moving merchandise and lacked any architectural influence or sense of style. This is where the theory of the duck and the shed were formed, looking at the two styles of building that seem to be imprinted within the suburban layout. This commercialism isn't just in design of its restaurants and stores. I also see this within casino and bar designs within Vegas. Take Caesar's Palace for example. It looks like a Roman palace with waitstaff in costumes serving guests and allowing them to enjoy the fantasy that they can live like gods. Vegas was designed around the idea of pleasure, and this is what it achieved with its lightness and ability to engulf the visitor in a new role. As Venturi and Brown put it, postmodernism is the inclusion of the daily in the surrounding, sacred and profane. This is what modern architecture lacks.
In the book Learning from Las Vegas, authors Venturi, Scott Brown and Eisenhower explore the role that signage plays in the city of Las Vegas, and specifically the Las Vegas Strip. The architecture of the Las Vegas Strip is heavily influenced by the significant use of cars, and signage has been targeted towards people travelling at greater speeds and distances than foot traffic. Due to the speed and scale at which elements are viewed, signage has become an important factor in attracting business and plays a major part in the overall architecture of the Strip. In the book, the authors describe the signage of gas stations in great length and explain how signage needs to work at 3 different distances. One sign for greater distances at a scale visible while travelling on the freeway, one for closer approaching traffic, and one while at the establishment. Not only does the signage have to work at different distances, it has to work at different times of the day. The sign must be functional and clear during sunlight hours, and work as a neon sign during the night. As the Strip is predominantly made up of casinos and hotels, it is arguably more important for the sign to be effective during the night than the daytime. Learning from Las Vegas highlighted 2 types of typical buildings, and as such 2 types of signage. The decorated shed signage was typically overscaled and overused compared to the rather discreet and often small-scale architecture associated with it. Here the sign would often play a more important role than the building itself. Essentially, the sign has become the architecture. The second type was the duck, where the building itself was in fact the sign and clearly illustrated the use of the building.
Venturi and Brown's examination of highway architecture reveals to us that the sign in front of a building is more important than the building itself. This rejection of functionalism explains that spatial relationships can instead be communicated through symbolism. This idea is best understood as a decorated shed. Decorated shed architecture is a result of what Venturi and Brown call the rule of Route 66. The highway is dotted with dispersed architecture characterized by the little building with the enormous sign out the front. This concept is common in Las Vegas, with oversized and extravagant signs which can be observed from a distance and in a vehicle at high speeds. Venturi and Brown also indicate that the building is usually set back from the road and of modest design and scale. Hall labels this same concept as roadside architecture, commonly used by hotels and fast food businesses to attract customers. The importance of the dominant sign is explained by Venturi and Brown, who tell us that if the sign is removed, the connection to place is lost. If the theorists are correct, we can imagine that a car travelling at high speed will have little to no awareness of the architecture approaching. Decorated sheds are generic buildings which use signs to explain function. The opposite to this is duck architecture. Duck architecture are buildings which are themselves a sign. Kolstad tells us that duck typologies use their shape and construction to explicitly represent the building's function.
Melbourne is Australia's second largest city and experienced a boom in architecture following the gold rush during the 1850s. While Melbourne as it stands today is an eclectic mix of architectural styles, its foundations were predominantly laid by the Victorian style of architecture that is still dominant in the city today. While examining Melbourne as a city, you will quickly notice the grid layout of the central business district. The city boasts a range of building types with a focus on commercialism that includes offices, retail, restaurants, hotels and public spaces. Religious buildings still dominate Melbourne's architecture, with Christian and Catholic churches still occupying some of the most valuable real estate in the city, as shown on this map. What was once an easy-to-navigate city by car has been disjointed in recent years due to selected major roads being restricted to pedestrian and tram traffic only. Public transport is easily navigated throughout the city and works well with the grid system to efficiently move occupants from A to B. This map shows tram routes and train stations throughout the CBD and demonstrates how travelling via public transport is easily achieved. With walking and public transport the method of choice, dedicated car parks are usually restricted to compact multi-level buildings or basement car parking below establishments, and there is less demand for car parking due to constant public transport improvements. Petrol stations are literally non-existent in the CBD due to the combination of little demand and expensive real estate. As a result of the increased foot traffic, advertising in the CBD of Melbourne is targeted towards pedestrians, and its scale reflects this. Signage is commonly positioned just above door height and directed in two ways. The first running adjacent to the shopfront to catch the eye of a pedestrian walking by. The second is directed towards the street to catch the eye of pedestrians on the opposite side of the road. Text on signage is rarely bigger than 1/2 metre in height, so as to not be too large a scale to read at close distances. Cars travelling through the city are usually moving at slow speeds due to congested traffic, so signage is able to be at a smaller scale, as it is easier to read. Although signage is evident throughout Melbourne City, it is incomparable to the scale and extravagant nature of the signage of the Las Vegas Strip. This could be assumed due to the lack of car traffic in the city. Where we start to see similarities between Melbourne and Las Vegas is middle suburbia. Here, major roads are often lined with decorated shed-type buildings, as identified by Venturi and Scott Brown in the book Learning from Las Vegas. Common buildings on major roads include major warehouse chains such as Bunnings or Harvey Norman. Signage is scaled up to suit the greater speeds that car traffic is travelling, and we can also observe the similarities between car parking being positioned to the front of the establishment, with the building set back from the road. The postmodernism movement has definitely influenced the Melbourne skyline, with an eclectic mix of postmodernist buildings scattered throughout the city. Most notably, the Arts Precinct features a number of postmodernist buildings such as the Victorian College of the Arts, designed by Edmund and Corrigan, and ACCA, designed by Wood Marsh. Both buildings display a playful use of form and scale. Symbolism is evident throughout the city of Melbourne and can be found in unsuspecting places such as this commercial building in the north of the CBD on Albert Street. The square facade of the building is decorated with a symbol of a typical shaped house. displaying the contradictory of commercial versus domestic as discussed by Venturi and Scott Brown. With a growing population and a greater demand for better public transport, Melbourne City has become a pedestrian-focused area. It is evident in the CBD that signage is scaled down and directed towards pedestrians. In contrast, the outer suburbs are still very much car-focused, and here we can observe many similarities with the Las Vegas Strip.
Sydney is a city which existed before the influence of the modern car and highways. Nevertheless, its growth and evolution into the city we know today share many attributes to the Las Vegas model. Sydney's Great Western Highway is a commercial stretch which connects the city centre to the western suburbs. We will observe its similarities to the highway architecture of Las Vegas, as well as its use of signage, symbolism, the decorated shed, and postmodernism. Sydney's highway adopts Venturi and Brown's Route 66 model. We can observe the same monumental signs with buildings set back from the road. The proximity of the highway to the city results in a dense organisation of signs and buildings which must work hard to gain attention. It is this density which closely resembles the landscape on the outskirts of the Las Vegas Strip. The modesty and simplicity of the Sydney highway buildings require the addition of large-scale signage to attract customers. This use of signage and billboards in Sydney is what Venturi and Brown would explain as a commercial vernacular. It is also what they call an architecture of communication, by which a traveller is bombarded with signs for both navigation and for commercial advertising. As can be seen in this image, the challenge is often discovering which sign has the most relevance to your journey. The decorated shed is the dominant architecture on the Sydney Strip. The most obvious example are the petrol stations, Bunnings Warehouse, Officeworks, and other food franchises. Just like in Las Vegas, the form of the shed could be adapted to almost any function, allowing the signage to indicate its purpose. These decorated sheds are also set back in the Las Vegas highway style to allow for car parking at the front of the building. This is highlighted in purple. The symbolic elements on the highway are most evident in the luxury car yard locations. In the Sydney model, the car yard appears to take the place of the casinos. In these spaces, the decorated shed is more ornamental. Their shiny and extravagant facades serve to create an atmosphere which convinces a customer to spend considerable amounts of money. Here, the building actually becomes a sign while symbolising luxury. The CBD of Sydney is the final destination of the highway where it merges to become George Street. George Street shares similarities to the Las Vegas Strip as a dense hive of activity, both spatially and socially. However, the Sydney CBD is a financial centre with impressive modern skyscrapers. The serious financial city does not embrace the whimsical nature of postmodernism which we see in Las Vegas. Instead, it embraces functionalist forms of modernism which remind us that the financial sector is reliable, accountable, and strong. These same themes are also reflected in the classical forms of the original banks which still stand alongside the modern glass towers. Las Vegas and Sydney are vastly different cities. However, we can see that both cities have evolved due to the rise of motorcar, highways, commercial architecture, and signage. The result is the formation of two sister cities, each sharing a great deal of DNA, but with vastly different personalities.
Turkish architecture has evolved over the 20th century since the Republic of Turkey was formed in 1923 after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. In its first year, Turkey's architecture was still influenced by Seljuk and Ottoman architecture. It wasn't until the 30s when the architectural style began to differ with foreign architectural influence. After World War I, it was a fascist style of architecture, trying to appear modern but nationalistic. It wasn't until the 50s when Western influence began to hit Turkey, with modernism sweeping through and closely followed by postmodernism. Some of the more obvious forms of postmodernism were summer resorts and tourist developments, kind of like the Roman-style casinos built in Las Vegas. These symbolic and outrageous buildings were built for beachside resorts as tourist traps. However, a closer examination of a city like Istanbul shows a more modest style of architecture, with brick houses, functional apartment buildings, and shared paved roads. Within Istanbul, the roads are intertwined and small, making vehicle access tight. Istanbul has grown bigger in recent years, with large skyscraper and apartment buildings beginning to form Istanbul's skyline, even overpowering historical buildings, with petitions by locals and government officials to tear down these skyscrapers. However, many of its low-cost housing still follows the old style of functionalism, still lacking a lot of symbolic architecture. Even their skyscrapers and contemporary work lack real symbolism. The basic concept of the strip is the growth of automobile and the need for large parking lots in front of large shed-like buildings to be seen at high speeds down long highways. Cities within Turkey have these elements, however scattered along stretches of highway and not as flashy as Vegas. The main signage along the roads are the road names and routes and signs to let you know where the nearest rest stops are. In the inner city, the highways there are typical large advertisements tacked on large buildings to be seen from a great distance. Examination of Turkey's highway would be quite pointless as they are mainly used as connection points between states. While driving down these highways, you will come across the typical Western-style gas station with a large lit-up sign along the road, with a small shed-like diner next to it. Istanbul is designed for small cars and lacks parking within city limits, unless you go out of the city border to large shopping malls, factories, warehouses, and IKEA. Istanbul is mainly based on foot traffic and is affected by commercialism, but not as flashy as Vegas, with basic printed signs placed over windows and doors with a classical style of architecture. This style of signage is similar to the inner city of Melbourne. The only flashy architectural facades that exist around Istanbul are the new big shopping complexes and hotels, with a more luxury feel than the local facades that everyday locals use. Therefore, within my analysis of learning from Las Vegas and Istanbul, I have found limited similarities, mainly due to the lack of automobiles in Istanbul and the more modest culture of Turkey. I have, however, found similarities with Melbourne's CBD layout, which also caters to pedestrians more than cars.
In comparing Las Vegas to our own cities, we learned that the rigidity of modernism cannot exist in isolation. Instead, we discover that the commercial influences of postmodernism are particularly dominant in the highway architecture, which channel us toward and through our cities. In each city, the highways have a dominant commercial vernacular, which adopt the Route 66 model. The model shows that most buildings are decorated sheds, which are set back from the road to allow for parking. In the same Las Vegas style, the sheds are modest and as such require the use of large signs to attract attention. These signs must be visible amongst a dense, competitive landscape and must be visible from a distance and in a car at high speeds. Las Vegas embraces postmodernism to the extreme, using ornament and reintroducing historical references. Our own cities, however, are a clear hybrid of architectural styles which come together to form a unique identity. Venturi and Brown's study is important, as it allows us to see that our cities require postmodernism to help us to navigate effectively and to use its commercial symbolism to understand our place in the world. Thank you for listening.